He found out the truth about the bride, but he didn't cancel the wedding. Instead, he prepared a surprise for her that she will remember for the rest of her life. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you're watching from. James Carter had built his life brick by brick, rising from nothing to become one of the most influential entrepreneurs in the country. He was a man of vision, perseverance, and undeniable intellect. Every decision he made was calculated. Every step forward was part of a grander design. From an early age, he had learned that the world was not kind to those who hesitated. His mother, a woman of relentless determination, had worked multiple jobs to put food on the table after his father walked out on them when James was barely 5. Growing up in a struggling neighborhood, he had seen both the dangers of failure and the power of resilience. He had been the top student in his school, earning a full-ride scholarship to one of the most prestigious universities in the country. While others partied, he studied. While others doubted, he strategized. By the time he graduated, he had already started his first company, a tech startup that revolutionized cloud computing. Investors lined up, eager to back his vision. Within a decade, he was worth over $100 million, his name synonymous with success and innovation. Despite his achievements, James had never let his wealth define him. He remained disciplined, pragmatic, and focused. Yet beneath the armor of confidence and intellect, he harbored a secret longing, a desire for something that money could never truly buy: love, real, unconditional love. Not admiration, not opportunistic companionship, but the kind of love that stood the test of time. And when he met Elizabeth Monroe, he believed he had finally found it. Elizabeth was the epitome of elegance, with striking features, icy blue eyes, and an aristocratic air that suggested centuries of refinement. She exuded an effortless charm. Although she had been raised in privilege, her family's fortune had dwindled over the years, leaving them with a name far grander than their bank accounts. Yet she carried herself as if nothing had changed, as if she still belonged to the world of the elite. James had met her at a high-profile charity gala, an event filled with old money and new wealth where appearances mattered more than sincerity. She had been standing alone near the grand piano, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of a champagne glass, her expression distant yet alluring. When their eyes met, she smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips that made his pulse quicken. They spoke for hours that evening, their conversation a dance of wit and intrigue. She was well versed in art, literature, and the intricate politics of high society. She listened with interest as he spoke about his business, his passion for technology, and his belief in innovation. She made him feel as though she saw him not as a millionaire or as a symbol of success, but as a man. By the end of the night, he knew he wanted to see her again. Their relationship unfolded like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. Elizabeth was everything he had ever dreamed of in a partner: graceful, intelligent, supportive. She attended his business functions with poise, charming his colleagues, and speaking about their future together with such conviction that he had no reason to doubt her sincerity. His friends and advisors, however, were not as easily convinced. One had remarked with a skeptical tone, "She's perfect," but James dismissed their concerns. He had spent his life making decisions based on logic and strategy, but love was different. Love required trust, and he trusted Elizabeth. Their engagement had been a spectacle. He had proposed on a private island under a canopy of stars with the ocean whispering against the shore. Elizabeth had gasped, tears glistening in her eyes as she accepted, slipping the diamond ring onto her delicate finger. It had been one of the happiest moments of his life. The wedding preparations began almost immediately. It was to be a grand affair, the kind that would be remembered for decades. An opulent estate was chosen as the venue, adorned with cascading flowers, crystal chandeliers, and a guest list that read like a who's who of the business and social elite. James had spared no expense, not because he wanted to impress the world, but because he wanted to give Elizabeth everything she deserved. He envisioned their life together, traveling the world, building a family, sharing a love that would last a lifetime. But as the wedding day approached, subtle changes in Elizabeth's behavior began to surface. At first, they were small moments of distraction, unexplained absences, and a certain distance in her gaze when she thought he wasn't looking. She assured him that it was simply the stress of the wedding preparations, and he believed her. Then came the whispers, muted conversations that ceased when he entered the room, the offhand remark from a friend who had seen Elizabeth somewhere she claimed not to have been, and the sense that something, somewhere, was off. Still, James pushed aside his doubts. He had never been a man to let fear dictate his actions. He had built his empire on confidence and conviction, and he had made his choice. Elizabeth was his future. On the eve of their wedding, he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, gazing out at the city that had once seemed so unattainable. He thought about the road that had brought him here, the sacrifices, the victories, the unwavering pursuit of success. And for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar creeping into his mind: doubt. But tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow will erase all uncertainty. Tomorrow I will stand before the world and vow to love Elizabeth Monroe for the rest of my life. Tomorrow I will become a husband, and nothing can change that. The morning light filtered through the towering windows of James's penthouse, casting golden reflections across the sleek marble floors. He stood before the mirror, fastening the buttons of his crisp white shirt with deliberate yet uncharacteristically slow movements. Today was supposed to be a day of excitement, a day where anticipation outweighed hesitation, where love silenced doubt. Yet the uncertainty that had settled in his mind the previous night had not faded with the rising sun. It lingered like an unfinished thought, persistent and unwelcome. Elizabeth was already at the estate, finalizing the last details of the wedding preparations. She had left early before dawn, sending him only a brief text telling him how much she looked forward to seeing him at the altar. He read her words again, trying to feel the warmth they should have carried. But instead of reassurance, he felt only distance. James had always trusted his instincts. They had guided him through every major decision in his life, steering him away from pitfalls and leading him to success. Yet now, when it mattered most, his instincts were at war with his emotions. The woman he loved, the woman he was about to marry, had done nothing overtly suspicious. There were no outright betrayals, no undeniable signs of deception, and yet something deep within him whispered that all was not as it seemed. It started with the small things, glances that lingered a second too long, moments where she seemed to be somewhere else entirely, and late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. At first, he had convinced himself it was just wedding stress, but then came the whispers. His friend Jordan had been the first of voices of concern. "Do you ever get the feeling that she's not all in?" Jordan had asked one night over drinks, as if she were keeping a part of herself hidden. James had laughed, brushing it off as pre-wired nerves. But as the days passed, the question settled uncomfortably in his mind. Then came the offhand remarks from other acquaintances, subtle hints that Elizabeth had been seen in places she hadn't mentioned, always in the company of someone she never named. He tried to silence his doubts by reminding himself who Elizabeth was. She was poised, elegant, the perfect partner. She was devoted, wasn't she? But real love should never leave room for uncertainty. That morning, as he adjusted his tie and studied his own reflection, James realized he could no longer ignore the growing suspicion. He needed clarity, and so, against his own hopes, he made a decision. He would seek the truth. By noon, he was sitting in his car outside the office of a private investigator, staring at the simple lettering on the door. A part of him felt ridiculous, like a man who was looking for trouble where none existed. But another part, the part that had built empires and seen through deception in the corporate world, told him this was necessary. When he stepped inside, the investigator, a man in his 50s with sharp eyes and the air of someone who had seen too much, listened to James's concerns without interruption. There was no judgment in his expression, only quiet assessment. "You want me to find out if she's hiding something?" the investigator summarized. When James finished, he said, "I want to be wrong." Surprising himself with the rawness of his words, he admitted, "I want to know. I've been imagining things." The investigator nodded and said, "Give me a few days. If there's nothing, there's nothing. If there is, you'll have the truth." As James left the office, he felt the weight of his decision settle over him. There was no turning back now. He had set something in motion, and whatever the outcome, he would have to face it. The next few days passed in a haze of wedding preparations and forced smiles. Elizabeth was radiant, playing the role of the devoted fiancée flawlessly. She laughed, she planned, and she spoke of their future as if it were already set in stone. And yet, when James looked into her eyes, he could not shake the feeling that she was hiding something just beyond his reach. Then came the call 3 days before the wedding. The investigator requested a meeting. James arrived at the discreet location, his stomach twisted in knots. He refused to acknowledge it. He told himself that he was about to hear nothing more than a reassurance that his suspicions had been unfounded. But the moment he saw the investigator's face, he knew there was no need for preamble. A folder was placed in front of him, thick with photographs, documents, and evidence. James hesitated before opening it, steeling himself for whatever lay within. The first photograph was of Elizabeth sitting at an upscale restaurant. Across from her, leaning in close, was a man James immediately recognized as Alexander Reed. His grip on the folder tightened, but he forced himself to keep looking. The next images were worse. Elizabeth and Alexander, walking through the lobby of a luxury hotel. Elizabeth in his arms, her face tilted toward him, their lips almost touching. Then, Elizabeth slipping into a private suite without once looking back. The investigator spoke, but his words barely registered. The truth was right in front of him, undeniable and brutal. Elizabeth had never been his, not truly. She had played her part beautifully, but her heart had belonged to another man all along. Alexander Reed, born into wealth and raised in privilege. The kind of man who had always been able to have anything he wanted except, apparently, the Monroe fortune, meant that Elizabeth had made her choice not out of love, but out of necessity. She was marrying James because he was the better deal. James sat in silence for a long time, the weight of realization crushing down on him. Every moment of their relationship replayed in his mind with cruel clarity. The calculated way she had woven herself into his life, the subtle ways she had always ensured that he remained enthralled by her. The whispers, the absences, the unanswered questions. Everything now had an answer. But beneath the anger, beneath the betrayal, there was something else. A cold, calculating part of him that had been honed through years in the business world. He had built his empire on strategy, on patience, on knowing when to strike. Elizabeth had played him for a fool. She would regret that mistake. As he closed the folder, his mind was already forming a plan. The wedding would go on. The world would see them stand together at the altar. And then, at the perfect moment, Elizabeth Monroe's carefully constructed world would come crashing down. James Carter had spent his life building an empire from nothing, and now he would watch as Elizabeth lost everything she had schemed to gain. James sat alone in his office, the city skyline stretching endlessly before him. The folder the investigator had given him lay unopened on his desk, though he had already memorized every damning image, every painful detail it contained. It had been nearly 24 hours since he had received the evidence of Elizabeth's betrayal, yet the initial shock had not faded. Instead, it had settled into something colder, sharper, a clarity that cut through the illusion he had allowed himself to believe for so long. He had spent years perfecting his ability to remain detached, to make decisions based on logic rather than emotion. It was what had propelled him to the top, what had turned him from a struggling kid in a broken home into a self-made success story. And yet, when it came to Elizabeth, he had ignored every instinct, every red flag, allowing himself to believe that for once he could have something real. The truth was now irrefutable. Elizabeth had never loved him. She had chosen him because he was the safest bet, the wealthiest bidder in an unspoken auction for her future. And all the while, she had continued her affair with Alexander Reed, as if James were nothing more than a financial contract she was bound to fulfill. He had spent the night reviewing everything, combing through old memories with the ruthless precision of a businessman dissecting a failed investment. Every moment that had once seemed genuine was now tainted. the soft kisses, the whispered reassurances, the way she had looked at him with what he had mistaken for love. It had all been a performance, a masterful deception designed to keep him ensnared. But she had underestimated him. Most men, upon discovering such a betrayal, would have called off the wedding immediately. They would have confronted her, demanded answers, and let anger dictate their actions. James, however, was not most men. He understood that revenge was not about rage or outbursts. It was about precision, control, and above all, patience. Elizabeth believed she had won. She believed she had secured her future by marrying him, regaining the status and wealth her family had lost. She had played her role flawlessly, weaving a narrative of love and devotion so convincing that no one, even James himself, had seen through it until now. And that was why he would not cancel the wedding. No, he would let it proceed exactly as planned. Every detail would remain the same. Every guest would arrive expecting a grand celebration of love and unity. The world would watch as Elizabeth Monroe walked down the aisle in her custom-designed gown, believing she was moments away from achieving everything she had schemed for. Then, in front of 300 guests, in front of the cameras and the flashing lights, in front of her family, her friends, and the high society she so desperately wanted to impress, her lies would be laid bare. He had spent the morning making arrangements, making calls, finalizing details. There was no room for error. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life, to anticipate every move before it was made. This would be no different. He would not give her the luxury of a quiet, private confrontation. There would be no screaming match, no heated exchange where she could spin lies in an attempt to salvage what little dignity she had left. Instead, there would be only silence. The silence of a room full of people watching as her carefully constructed world shattered around her. The thought brought him no joy, no satisfaction. If anything, he felt only a cold detachment, as though he were merely overseeing another business venture. There was no longer any emotion attached to Elizabeth. She was not his fiancée. She was not the woman he had once loved. She was simply another liability that needed to be handled. That evening, at the final wedding rehearsal, Elizabeth greeted him with a radiant smile, slipping her arms around him as if nothing had changed. He let her play her part just as she had played hers. Her family was present, beaming with pride, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend. "You're quiet tonight," Elizabeth murmured as they stood together watching the event planner make last-minute adjustments. "Just thinking about tomorrow," he replied smoothly, meeting her gaze with an unreadable expression. She smiled and squeezed his hand. "It's going to be perfect," she said, and he said nothing. The next day, James woke before dawn. He dressed in silence, methodically preparing for what was to come. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. The plan was already in motion. At precisely noon, he arrived at the estate. The venue was breathtaking, a testament to the extravagance Elizabeth had insisted upon. White roses adorned every surface, golden chandeliers sparkled overhead, and an orchestra played softly in the background. Guests were arriving, laughter and conversation filling the air. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries, accepting congratulations with a polite nod. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was in her dressing room, preparing for her grand entrance, oblivious to the fate that awaited her. As the ceremony began, James took his place at the altar. The room fell into a hushed reverence as the doors opened, and Elizabeth stepped forward, a vision in white. The guests sighed in admiration as cameras flashed to capture the moment. She walked toward him with confidence and an expression of triumph, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to marvel at her audacity. Even now, standing at the precipice of her downfall, she had no idea what was coming. The vows were exchanged, the officiant's words a mere formality, and then, as planned, James took the microphone and turned to address the gathered guests. "I want to take a moment to thank everyone for being here today," he began steadily, his voice composed and unwavering. "This day has been a long time in the making, and I know that many of you have traveled great distances to celebrate this union. Elizabeth stood beside him, smiling graciously, believing she was seconds away from victory. Because you've all taken the time to be here, I think it's only fair that I share something with you. Something important, something I recently discovered. A murmur of confusion rippled through the guests as confused glances were exchanged. James then turned toward the back of the room, where a team of discreetly positioned assistants stood ready. With a single nod from him, the screens positioned around the venue flickered to life. The first photograph appeared, Elizabeth laughing in the dim light of a restaurant, her hand resting intimately on Alexander Reed's. The room fell silent. Then another image appeared, Elizabeth slipping into a luxury hotel, Alexander's arm possessively wrapped around her waist. A gasp, a stunned murmur rippling through the crowd. And then came the final blow, a series of text messages enlarged on the screens, displaying Elizabeth's own words in cold, damning text. Of course I don't love him, but once we're married it won't matter. I'll have everything I need. Elizabeth turned to him, horror dawning in her eyes, but James did not look at her. Instead, he addressed the crowd one final time. There will be no wedding today. I do appreciate you all coming. Then he stepped away, leaving Elizabeth frozen in place, her perfect facade crumbling, her world reduced to nothing but whispered accusations and the cold, unrelenting weight of her own betrayal. James walked out of the ceremony hall, leaving behind the echoes of gasps and whispers. His steps were measured and unhurried, his mind already calculating the next steps and considering the inevitable fallout. Elizabeth would attempt to recover. She would seek damage control, perhaps even try to shift the narrative in her favor, but she wouldn't have that chance. He had not just revealed her betrayal. He had eliminated every escape route. By the time he reached the waiting car, his assistant Ethan was already there, his expression unreadable. He had been briefed on the plan in advance, though James had not shared every detail. Some things had to be witnessed firsthand. "It's done," Ethan said in a calm voice tinged with something James couldn't quite place, perhaps admiration or maybe disbelief. James gave a curt nod and stepped into the car. The driver pulled away from the estate, leaving the chaos behind for the first time in weeks. James allowed himself to exhale. The first stage was complete, but there was still work to be done. Elizabeth's downfall would not be confined to a single moment of public humiliation. That was merely the beginning. If she had truly believed she could manipulate him, she had grossly underestimated him. He had not built his empire by acting on impulse or emotion. Every move was deliberate, calculated. He opened his phone and scrolled through the messages. As expected, his inbox was flooded with notifications from business partners, family members, and journalists, all eager for a comment. He ignored them all except one. A message from the investigator confirming that Alexander Reed's firm was tied to the Monroe family's debts. A slow smile touched James's lips as he had suspected all along. Alexander Reed was not just Elizabeth's lover. He was part of the scheme. The Monroe family's financial troubles were worse than they had let on, and they had been counting on this marriage as their salvation. Now that their lifeline had been severed, they would be left scrambling. The car pulled into the underground parking lot of his high-rise, and James stepped out with his mind already shifting to the next phase. Ethan followed silently until they reached the private elevator. "You really planned all of this?" Ethan said, shaking his head. "I mean, I knew you wouldn't just let it slide, but damn." James glanced at him and replied, "If someone tries to play me, I don't just walk away, I make sure they never get the chance to do it again." Ethan exhaled, nodding in understanding. "And what's next?" James's gaze was steady. "We finish it." The elevator doors opened, and they stepped into the penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, a landscape of power and ambition, a view James had earned through precision and determination, and it was a view that Elizabeth would never share again. He walked to his desk and powered on his laptop. The files from the investigator were already waiting. He scanned the documents, confirming what he already knew. The Monroe family's debts were extensive, hidden behind layers of shell companies and falsified assets. They had been on the verge of collapse, clinging to the illusion of wealth while their foundation crumbled. And Elizabeth, she had been their last desperate gamble. James closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, considering his options. He could simply let them fall. The scandal alone would be enough to send them into ruin. But that was not enough. He wanted to ensure that when they fell, they had nothing left to salvage. He made his first call, a banker in Zurich, someone who owed him a favor. Within an hour, any remaining credit lines the Monroes had managed to maintain would be frozen. The second call was to an associate in the media industry. By morning, every major publication would have the full story, not just of Elizabeth's betrayal, but of the Monroe family's financial deceit. The third call, however, was the most important. Alexander Reed's phone rang 3 times before the man answered, his voice sharp with barely concealed tension. "I was wondering when you'd call," Alexander said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. James was silent for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle. "How does it feel to know that everything you and Elizabeth schemed for is gone?" Alexander scoffed, though there was an unmistakable edge of anxiety in his tone. "You think you've won? You embarrassed her, sure, but this will blow over. The world forgets scandals faster than you think." James smiled, though there was no humor in it. "You're right. People forget scandals, but financial ruin that lasts does not. Now, your firm is being audited. Every fraudulent deal, every mismanaged fund, it's all coming to light. And the Monroe family? They'll be lucky if they can afford their own lawyers." A heavy silence followed. James let it linger before delivering the final blow. "You wanted power. You wanted influence, but you made a mistake, Alexander. You bet against the wrong man." He ended the call without waiting for a response. There was nothing left to say. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. The perfect engagement had turned into a public catastrophe. Journalists dissected every detail, from Elizabeth's affair to the collapse of the Monroe fortune. Photos of her standing frozen at the altar, her face a mask of horror, were splashed across every major news outlet. Alexander Reed's firm faced immediate scrutiny. Stocks plummeted as investors fled the Monroe family. And once revered in high society, they became nothing more than a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, James carried on. He attended meetings, closed deals, and continued to build his empire. Whenever anyone mentioned Elizabeth, he brushed it off with a knowing smile. She was a mistake, nothing more, just a lesson learned. Nearly a week later, as the repercussions of that day continued to ripple through the media and society alike, Ethan knocked on James's office door. "She wants to see you," Ethan said simply. James looked up, unsurprised, and after a long moment of contemplation, he shook his head. "She made her choice," he said, and Ethan nodded before leaving the room. James then turned back to his work, but for a brief moment, he allowed himself to think of Elizabeth, not with anger or regret, but simply as a fragment of the past, a closed chapter. She had played her game well, but she had never stood a chance. Meanwhile, the estate continued to exude an air of opulence and control, a stark contrast to the personal chaos unfolding behind the scenes. In the days that followed, the world moved on quickly. Reporters dissected every detail of the wedding that never was, and experts speculated on what Elizabeth's next move would be. Former associates of the Monroe family came forward with stories of financial mismanagement and desperation. The family name, once held in such high regard, became nothing more than a cautionary tale. Alexander Reed's firm suffered a heavy hit as investors pulled out and board members scrambled to do damage control. Yet James carried on as if nothing had changed. Meetings were scheduled, deals were signed, and the empire he had built remained untouchable. He had no time for the past or for what-ifs or regrets. And sometimes, late at night when the city was quiet and distractions had faded, he would think back to that moment. The moment Elizabeth realized she had lost, the moment she understood that the life she had planned and counted on was gone forever. And in those moments, he felt nothing at all. The world did not stop for Elizabeth Monroe. It did not pause to offer her sympathy, nor did it grant her the reprieve she so desperately needed. Instead, it moved forward at an unforgiving pace, sweeping her into a whirlwind of disgrace and public scrutiny. The morning after the disaster at the estate, Elizabeth woke to a nightmare far worse than the moment James had walked away. Headlines dominated every news site. Social media platforms were flooded with images of her humiliation. Videos captured the instant James turned to the crowd, the flicker of confusion on her face, and the moment the screens lit up with the truth. The camera flashes captured every reaction, from the horrified gasps of the guests to the fury in her father's eyes. She had not left her room at the Monroe family's townhouse on the Upper East Side since that night. The curtains remained drawn, and the once pristine suite was strewn with remnants of a future that no longer existed. Her wedding dress, still in its protective cover, hung lifelessly in the corner, a cruel reminder of the day that had unraveled before it had truly begun. Her parents abandoned any pretense of comfort. Her father, Edward Monroe, barely spoke to her, his fury simmering beneath the brittle surface of forced composure. Her mother's sharp whispers echoed through the halls, speaking of damage control and salvaging what little was left. But there was nothing left to salvage. The Monroe name, once synonymous with old money and prestige, became synonymous with scandal. Their remaining business interests, already unstable before the wedding, crumbled under the weight of bad press and fleeing investors. What James had revealed about their financial situation added fuel to the fire. Banks began to pull back, cutting ties that once seemed unbreakable. Creditors circled like vultures, and the carefully maintained illusion of wealth and stability collapsed in mere days. Elizabeth had spent her life in circles where image was everything, and now she was the subject of hushed whispers, the woman who had been exposed for who she truly was. She had believed she could control the narrative, that with enough poise and deflection, she could emerge from the wreckage with something intact. But this was not a scandal that could be spun or buried. It was absolute. She had tried to reach James. She had called once, then twice, then again and again, until it became clear that he would never answer. She left long, desperate messages, asking for a chance to explain, to meet, to say something that would make him understand. Deep down, however, she knew there was nothing she could say. The man who had once looked at her with admiration, who had once shown something close to love, was gone. In desperation, she turned to Alexander. She waited for him to call, to offer reassurance or a plan for how they could move forward. But Alexander Reed, a man who had always valued his own survival above all else, had been in the crowd that day watching as James tore their secret apart. He had done nothing to defend her, nothing to stand by her side as she lost everything. When she finally mustered the courage to call him, his voice was distant and clipped. "This isn't my problem, Elizabeth." The words stunned her. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "We were in this together." "No," Alexander replied, coolly. "You were in this for yourself. You thought you could pull this off? I told you James was dangerous. I told you he wouldn't let this slide. You were part of it, too." She snapped, gripping the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "You benefited just as much as I did. Don't act like you weren't standing right beside me the whole time." Alexander sighed long and exasperatedly. "I don't have time for this, Elizabeth. You need to figure your own way out of this mess. We both do." And then he hung up. The realization hit her with crushing finality. She had always believed she understood power, believed she knew how to navigate the world of wealth and influence. But in the end, she had been nothing more than a pawn. Stripped of everything, there was no one left to save her. Her father's fury erupted 3 days later as he paced the length of his study, his face red with barely restrained rage. "You ruined us. Do you even understand what you've done?" Elizabeth stood frozen, clutching her arms around herself as if that could shield her from the storm. "I was trying to save us," she weakly replied. Edward Monroe laughed with a sharp, humorless sound. "Save us? You were playing a game you never had the intelligence to win." He turned on her, his voice cold. "And now, because of your arrogance, because of your greed, our name is worth nothing." The words struck deeper than she had expected. Not because they were cruel, but because she knew they were true. She had always thought she could outmaneuver James Carter. She had believed he was blinded by love, that he would never see who she truly was until it was too late. But she had been wrong. He had seen her. He had watched and waited, playing along until he had everything he needed to destroy her, and he had done it without hesitation. The calls from former friends stopped, invitations disappeared, and her social accounts were flooded with comments, some gleeful, some cruel, all reveling in her downfall. There was no sympathy for the world she once belonged to. Only the cold, unrelenting truth remained. She had lost. The final blow came a week later when her father gathered the family in the sitting room, his expression grim. "We're selling the townhouse," he announced. "We can't afford to keep up appearances anymore." Her mother added in a hollow voice, "There's nothing left." Elizabeth stared at them, unable to process it, repeating the word leaving as if it were foreign. Her father's expression was filled with disgust. "This is what happens when you bet on the wrong man," he said. Elizabeth wanted to argue, to scream that she had done what she thought was best, that she had been so close to securing everything they needed, but none of it mattered. A month ago, she had been preparing for a wedding that would have cemented her place among the elite. Now she was being forced to leave the only world she had ever known, stripped of the wealth and privilege upon which she had built her entire life. And the worst part was that she knew she had done it to herself. Years passed, but the memory of that day never truly faded. Scandals have a way of slipping from the public's consciousness, replaced by new headlines, new controversies, new stories that capture attention. Yet for those who had lived through them, for those who had lost everything, the past lingered, haunting even in the quietest moments. For James Carter, life moved forward. His empire only grew stronger, expanding beyond what even he had once envisioned. His name, already synonymous with success, became even more revered, not just as a businessman, but as a man who had outmaneuvered deception itself. He had proven that he was not someone to be played. Those who had once whispered doubts about his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of wealth and influence now spoke of him with admiration or, at the very least, with caution. His life was not untouched by the past, but he refused to let it define him. He buried himself in work, in a relentless pursuit of something greater. Relationships came and went, women drawn to him for different reasons, some more genuine than others. But he never let himself be fooled again. The love he had once believed in became a luxury he no longer desired. And yet, despite all his accomplishments and despite the satisfaction of knowing he had risen beyond betrayal, there were nights when he found himself staring at the city skyline, his mind drifting back to a moment long since left behind. The weight of memory did not always bring pain, but it never quite let go either. Elizabeth Monroe had disappeared from his world entirely after the scandal, after the downfall of her family. She vanished from the circles she once reigned over. Her name, once spoken with admiration, had become a cautionary tale, a stark example of what happens when ambition outstrips intelligence. The Monroe estate was sold off, their wealth depleted, their influence shattered. Her father, Edward Monroe, once a man who commanded respect, had faded into irrelevance, retreating from a city that no longer had a place for him. For a long time, James had not thought of her at all. She had become nothing more than a lesson. And yet, fate had its own way of tying up loose ends. On an unremarkable day, years after it all, he saw her again. He had been in the city for a meeting, one of countless others, another deal, another expansion. The restaurant was one he had frequented before, a quiet, upscale place where conversations were spoken in hushed tones, and every patron knew the unwritten rules of discretion. Seated near the window, finishing a call, he glanced up and saw her. Elizabeth. The recognition came instantly, even after all this time. She was different yet unmistakably the same. The confidence, the effortless poise, the aura of someone who had once commanded attention. But it was gone now. She moved quietly through the room, no longer the woman who had once been the center of every gathering. Dressed in a simple black dress, understated and elegant in a way that did not demand admiration but rather avoided it, she did not see him at first. Focused on her work, carrying a tray to one of the tables, and speaking softly to the patrons, She appeared as just a waitress for a moment. James simply watched, having imagined many endings for Elizabeth Monroe, though this had never been one of them. He had expected her to land somewhere, perhaps not in wealth, but in comfort, using whatever charm she had left. Instead, here she was, serving people who once would have fought to be in her company. She turned, and their eyes met for a fleeting second, and in that instant, recognition flashed across her face. Shock, shame, and something else, something she quickly masked before looking away. She did not acknowledge him. She did not try to speak, instead continuing her work as if nothing had happened. James could have called her over, could have spoken if only to see what she would say, if she would try to rewrite the past, but he did not. He simply watched for another moment, then rose from his seat and left the restaurant, stepping into the cool night air. He felt nothing, no triumph, no lingering bitterness, only the quiet knowledge that the past had settled itself in the way it always did. Elizabeth Monroe had gambled and lost, and James Carter had never looked back. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Check out more of our videos for stories that will keep you hooked. Share this video with others, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments.